Hello, I am Mother Nancy Springer, and I'm here with the Reverend David Matthews as we continue our conversation of Isaiah. We are in chapter 35 today, and if you were with us with chapter 34, you'll be so glad you joined us today because it really does make up for all the hard stuff we talked about in the previous video. So, David, you want to start us off by reading?
Will do. So chapter 35, verses 1 through, I'm going to read 1 through 4. And just a reminder, we're reading from the Common English Bible, but whatever version you have in front of you, please follow along. The desert and the dry land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom like crocus. They will burst into bloom and rejoice with joy and singing. They will receive the glory of Lebanon, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the Lord's glory, the splendor of our God. Strengthen the weak hands and support the unsteady knees. Say to those who are panicking, be strong, don't fear. Here's your God, coming with vengeance, with divine retribution. God will come to save you.
Then the eyes of the blind will be opened and the ears of the deaf will be cleared. Then the lame will leap like a deer and the tongue of the speechless will sing. Waters will spring up in the desert and streams in the wilderness. The burning sand will become a pool and the thirsty ground fountains of water. The jackal's habitat, a pasture. Grass will become reeds and rushes. A highway will be there. It will be called the Holy Way. The unclean won't travel on it, but it will be for those walking on that way. Even fools won't get lost on it. No lion will be there and no predator will go up on it. None of these will be there. Only the redeemed will walk on it. The Lord's ransomed ones will return and enter Zion with singing, with everlasting joy upon their heads. Happiness and joy will overwhelm them. Grief and groaning will flee away. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Oh, thanks be to God. They should not have broken 35 and 34 apart as chapters, I think.
Can I have a word with the editor?
Yeah. What do you think? Start talking us through it. There is so much to unpack here.
Well, as he said, it's important for us again to remember that these chapters were created by, again, not the person who originally compiled this or wrote this, but by someone much later than that, just as a way to be able to give benchmarks for people who are reading. And maybe that's part of the idea, is that 35 really is a complete change in the story. It's a fresh movement. And here we come to the desert and the dry land will be glad. Well, last chapter, we ended basically with the desert. That's it. That's all there is this land of death and evil residing in it. And yet now we're being told the desert and the dry land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom like the crocus. And so here we see this transformation of what was dead to new life. And Nancy, you had made mention in our last video about them not having that prophecy of the dry bones. And here in the beginning of this chapter, I really think that this is the equivalent. This is the story of life coming into the land of death. And that's what immediately we jump off on.
Yeah.
So we get to the burst. They will burst into bloom and rejoice with joy and singing. They will receive the glory of Lebanon, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the Lord's glory, the splendor of our God. So, and I think that's an incredible point here, is that last chapter, with all the destruction and all the death being pronounced and all of the vengeance being poured out, we're not being told we're seeing the glory of God. When do we hear that we're seeing the glory of God? When God's bringing new life. That's the glory. The other part is the stuff that might need to happen, God might need to do, but people can bring death and destruction, but God alone can bring new life. And I think that's the glory part. That's the amazing thing here.
Yeah.
So that's the beginning. There's a lot more to come, but that's immediately what we see. Is there in the first two verses here? What have I missed? What are your thoughts about that?
I think what you said is great, right? That yeah, only God can bring new life, and that is the glory that all of the stuff that comes in the next verses will reveal.
Okay, so what are those?
So we have the weak hands are strengthened and unsteady knees are supported, um, and we are told those who are panicking, right? Because we have seen this vision of death and destruction. But we're told to be strong and don't fear. Here is God coming with vengeance, right? So we had read in a previous chapter, and my brain is not pulling up which one just yet, right? That God roared and everyone panicked, right? The righteous and the unrighteous, and as it should be, right? If God's voice comes out in a roar, even those who are truly righteous in God's eyes are gonna go, have mercy on me, God, I'm a sinner, right?
Mhm.
And so these reassuring words are of be strong and don't fear. God is coming and God will save you. Right? Those who have the eyes to see and the ears to hear God through all of the death and destruction can hear these words of comfort and peace and joy.
Yeah, and just to touch on that piece that you just said, have mercy on me, a sinner. Yeah, that image of the Jesus gave of, the two people, one saying, Lord, thank you for not making me like that sinner, and the other one saying, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. One of them was right in the sight of God and was wise. And it wasn't the man who thanked God for not making him like the sinner. And
Right.
so the fear and trembling in the presence of God and in God's roar is wise, because we can't, even Christians, we can't stand on our own 2 feet and say, God, thank you for not making me like the sinner over there. We ourselves, even in our assurance that the blessed gift of Jesus's blood, it's not something you or I did. It's still something he did. So it's still, to be honored and to be revered.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but that last line, though, God will come to save you, a very stark contrast with the 2 lines earlier, coming with vengeance, with divine retribution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That again, it is God's hand that is both judgment and mercy, right?
Yeah, and that to save you, he has to bring vengeance or destruction, punishment, or something upon the person who is oppressing you, who is holding you
Right.
captive, enslaving you. He needs to
Right.
free you by breaking chains. And so, if the chains are a person who won't let go of you, that person's on the wrong side of things.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So we get to some, in my mind, some of the most beautiful languages, words of scripture in the next couple of verses here. Then the eyes of the blind will be open, the ears of the deaf will be cleared. Then the lame will leap like the deer, and the tongue of the speechless will sing. Waters will spring up in the desert and the streams in the wilderness. And it's just beautiful language in my mind, because as soon as I read these verses, my mind jumps to the story. Well, to quite frankly, the lines we read every funeral, right? Where every tear will be wiped away. But not just that, but to the actions of everybody who met Jesus. It was, what did they do? Well, the injured, the sick leapt for joy. They danced.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was just
Even at,
amazing.
yeah. I mean, even, right, John leapt in Elizabeth's womb when Mary walked in the room pregnant with Jesus, right? I mean, just the very presence um, makes us leap with joy. The lame will leap like the deer in the next verse.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned John the Baptist, because of course John the Baptist, he sends the message to Jesus at the end of his life, Lord, are you really the one, or is there somebody else we're awaiting, right? And what is Jesus says, blessed are those who, the lame will walk and the blind will see. Blessed is he who does not fall away on account of me. And it's this sentiment, this statement here of the fullness of what exists in Jesus's presence.
Right. All of the brokenness, all of the sickness, all of the disability, all of the inability will be healed and restored to God's original intent of creation, right? So in chapter 34, we had all the undoing of creation. And here we will have the next step is then the restoring of creation to its original intent of wholeness and wellness.
Yeah, and what brought in, of course, that undoing of creation or the pollution of creation was sin. And so that sin in its culmination, God then brought in the undoing of that creation, the getting rid of it and its pollutants and its sickness. And so getting rid of all of it. And so we come to verse 7 here. After the streams in the wilderness, right? Verse at the end of verse 6, waters will spring up in the desert and streams in the wilderness. And that's just where we left in chapter 34 was that desert. These nations being transformed into this wasteland. And yet God now bringing about a transformation again of that wasteland, that place of death and destruction, now new life. The burning sand will become a pool, the thirsty ground, fountains of water, the jackal's habitat, a pasture, grass will become reeds and rushes. So, as Nancy, we were talking about earlier, you made mention when we talked about the jackal's habitat, you immediately said the Lion King. And yeah, and it's that sense of, everything the light touches, everything that is good and wholesome, that is growing life, is God's. And then there's that dark space over there that is full of death. And now here in these verses, we've got new life everywhere. All over this, including that there is no place anymore that the light doesn't touch. It's now everywhere.
Yeah. And it's the parallel to the previous chapter in 34 of the jackals have taken over there, and now the jackal's habitat has become a pasture. And what we envision in a pasture are the animals from the beginning of chapter 34, right? The sheep and the goats and the cows and the rams, right? These docile farm animals, ranch style animals that are for good and for food to sustain life and for sacrifice to atone for sin, right? Everything's kind of set back as it should be.
But it's set back even so because there's no language here of the sacrifice, right? Of sacrifices again being needed or put back into play. There's just life.
There will be no need for that. Just life. Yeah, exactly.
And we come to verse 8, which I truly, when I first read it, it just sort of gave me that tingly sensation, those goosebumps. And highway will be there. It will be called the holy way. The unclean won't travel on it, but there will be, it will be for those walking on that way. Even fools won't get lost on it.
There's so much hope in that one line. Even fools won't get lost on it.
Yes. I found great joy in that line. Stick on that way, David. Cling to that way, and you won't get lost.
That's right.
And of course, we as Christians, with our Christian language, the holy way, immediately our mind should jump to Jesus. He is the way, the truth, the life. And on that way, clinging to him, even a fool can't get lost if you cling to him.
Right. So that is what makes you wise.
And in an interesting line, of course, it says the unclean won't travel on it, but it'll be for those walking on that way. So here we get the sense of the unclean. It's not referring to those who are, vaccinated or unvaccinated peoples, but it's referring to these people who are the unclean, those who have sinned and chosen their sin, because we've already seen new life come in, but the idea being that there's still those who have turned away from God and chosen that way.
Yeah.
So there won't be the unclean. But it's an interesting point, because my question to this is, after the death and destruction of the last chapter, are there any unclean left with the new life that's come in? And that's the piece I am unclear about in this chapter. Is it that there won't be any unclean traveling on it because there aren't any unclean left? They've all been destroyed. Or is it that the unclean just won't get on this pathway?
Or is it that that everyone who steps on it is made clean? Right? That it won't, but it will be for those walking on that way. If you choose to walk the way of Jesus, right? If you step into Jesus' way, you are made clean. And so I think that it brings to mind for me, right, that day when every knee shall bow, right? Everyone that's left will see the glory of God and bow down and say, "You are God," and proclaim the name of the Holy One. And so I think it's for me, that's where that imagery takes me, is that day when everybody says, "You are God."
And absolutely. And that's one of the things that's difficult about dealing with prophetic books and languages. When is this prophecy going to be fulfilled? And you get many people who have battled in denominations over this language of, trying to decipher that. And we get concepts such as pre-tribulation and post-tribulation and things like that. And it's about this question: is where does this text fit in with the larger concept of eschatology, of when God is going to bring about certain events and things that he's promised? So is this prophecy an end of time prophecy after he's already destroyed the heavens and the earth and is remaking things? Well, is that before or after his judgment of all people? Is the destruction the judgment, or after the destruction, is he going to raise everybody back up and then judge finally those who have now been raised? So there are these different questions that now fall into how we determine and discern where these texts fall in. And that's difficult. I think we can all agree that the way, or the way, the life, and what brings about this joy, what brings about this new life, is Jesus himself. And that's what we as Christians see, and what Isaiah is pointing at here is this future hope, this new, that God, one, can create new life, and that after this new life has been created, there won't be any straying from this new life. There will be a highway that you are on that you cannot fall off, that a fool could stay on, and the unclean won't come on it. In other words, you can't be made unclean by walking on it, and you can't be dragged off of it by somebody else, because anybody who's on it is also clean. They're also on the same direction and path you are. So you can't be made unclean by being on it. And I think that's more the point, is that he's trying to say, is that you're on it, you are clean, you're going to continue to be clean, and you're going to get where it's going. And that's the life.
And that's right. Jesus then kind of muddles all that. When does this happen in history even more? And to me, he's saying, right, don't worry about all that. The kingdom is at hand. It is right here, and live on earth as it is in heaven now. Right? So all these, we live as if all of this had already come to fruition, right?
Yeah, and that's a wonderful thought, Nancy. And it does call us to question some language that we have used in the past, Christians have used in the past, about this idea of backsliding. Well, can you backslide? Hold on. Can you backslide if you're on this highway then? Can you fall off? Can you get off? Like, where does this put people? And people will ask this, but I think it gets back to your point, is that you grab a hold of Jesus and then you just go with that. You go with him.
because there's always grace and forgiveness, right? I mean, we all trip and stumble, and it's the right, what we talked about at the very beginning. The righteous person is going to see Jesus and say, have mercy on me, a sinner. Not because they're trying to be extra righteous, but because they understand their own brokenness.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
so there's always mercy and grace and forgiveness as we follow Jesus.
absolutely. And again, it gets back to anybody who is wise, when they hear the lion roar, trembles.
Yeah.
And that's wisdom.
Right.
So we get to verse 10 here, and it says, the Lord's ransom ones will return and enter Zion with singing, and everlasting joy upon their heads. Happiness and joy will overwhelm them. Grief and groaning will flee away. Really is just a beautiful chapter.
It is. Yeah, it's beautiful. And just the way that Jesus tells us to live, as it, on earth as it is in heaven, here and now, in every moment. So.
And yeah, it's his kingdom has started. His kingdom has begun today in and amongst his people, in their hearts, in their lives, how they treat others around them. His churches are meant to look like this, like these places. So that's the dream. That's the dream.
That is.
All right. Well, Nancy, we're at the end of verses here. Is there anything any summarization that you need, that you want to bring, or is there anything you feel that we might have glossed over?
I think we covered it well. I love ending on the joyful hope of we can have heaven on earth now as we follow Jesus. So I think that's a great way to end it. Before we get into anything bad again.
Yes, and we are shifting, as I often say, we're shifting gears. We're going in a new route. The authors or compilers of this book have decided that the next couple of chapters are going to be devoted to putting this into a time and a place in history. And so they've put in some chapters on the history of what's going on in Israel, supposedly or presumably at this time. So it gives us a bit of contextual understanding. And so it depends. Again, commentators have said how this book is put together is different. And so you never know, we might talk about that another day. But
so the next 3 chapters will all just kind of be historical reference, and we'll cover those in the next few videos before we cross the bridge that will continue this joy in chapter 40.
Yeah, and then we get into some new and some very famous verses as well about really the joy that's coming.
Yeah.
All
right. So keep joining us. Keep doing the work and the difficult sometimes reading. And we do invite you to enter any questions or thoughts you have in the comments as you're watching these. We appreciate your time that you have given us in these videos. So, all right, Dave, what else do you have to say? Anything?
No, other than that, just God bless. And we'll look forward to enjoying to read the Bible with you again soon.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.